Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Let me start by welcoming you to the Center for Global Development and to this conversation, which
Recording in progress.
Which I'm really excited about with Achim Steiner, who is the administrator, the head of the United Nations Development Program. Achim is now in his fifth year, just finished, I think, coming up to the end of his fifth year. Beginning of his second term as the administrator, and of course has a long and distinguished career before he came to this current role. And Achim, I would just say welcome back rather than welcome, because the last time you and I had a conversation was close to 2 years ago. I think it was in May 2020. And at that time, we had just got into the first couple of months of adjusting to the reality of the COVID pandemic, and we were, as Achim, you and I were saying before we went live, that we were still marveling at the fact that people were beginning to work and find ways of working virtually, and our focus was very much on how COVID would change the way development would proceed and the impact on developing countries. And here we are 2 years later, and of course the pandemic still very much an ongoing issue for so many countries that it's easy to lose sight of, that in countries around the world, we've got another year or 2 or 3 of the consequences of the pandemic ahead of us. But alongside that, so much has happened in the last 2 years. We've seen a complete increase in the numbers of crises, humanitarian crises. And right now, of course, all eyes are on what is happening in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and all the terrible stories coming out of there. A few months ago, we were very much focused on similarly what was happening in Afghanistan and the risk of food insecurity, of famine, and of trying to find a way of putting a floor into what was spiraling down as an economy in Afghanistan. And of course, there are crises that you can see in the Horn of Africa, the issues around Sahel, and many others that we can point to. So there's that set of issues. Food and fuel prices now a consequence for so many countries in terms of putting additional strain on households and on national budgets. And then on top of that, we also have ongoing issues that have just worsened, problems of debt, problems of financing. So, Achim, if I might, I'd like to sort of get your take a little bit. How do we try and put this picture together? Because I think it's sort of almost hard now for people to get a sense of how you bring all of these different crises and issues in some coherent way of thinking, and what should we be doing as a way of responding? What is the world doing? And then what is the UNDP's unique role in this? So perhaps we could start with that, and then we can drill down into some more specific areas. But welcome, and always great to see you back here.
Masood, first of all, thank you for your kind invitation to return. And yes, we were hoping to do this in live format, but perhaps we are taking advantage of a world that is much more connected today. So perhaps that's one of the few things that we can perhaps sort of celebrate as an advance in the last few years, that indeed not only the understanding of digital, but connectivity in general have advanced quite fast, not least because the pandemic forced us to. But, being with you and being hosted in a discussion with you at the Center for Global Development, let's be very clear. This has been a disastrous period for development. And you have just listed, a number of the crises and challenges we face right now. And I think the harsh truth is we are a world in stress, under stress. And I think in many parts of the world actually facing distressed communities and realities. War, whether in Ukraine or in Yemen, are perhaps the most extreme form of destruction and violence that humans can unleash on other human beings. But below that open combat kind of setting, there are a number of crises that have been with us and have, in a sense, taken us sometimes to the point of almost no return. Take climate change. We are still increasing our emissions as a global family every year, although we know that the time window is probably now less than a decade if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees. And for hundreds of years, the choice of turning that around is simply gone. We are seeing inequality becoming ever more pervasive in many parts of the world. And ironically, the more you develop, the more inequality can become one of those drivers that tears societies apart. Perhaps not surprising to statisticians, but it is interesting to observe that very often in the name of accelerated development, GDP growth, one of the things we seem to be willing to accept, or at least accept as a theoretical condition, is greater inequality. Is it really inevitable? Because time and again, we see that becoming a real divider in our societies. And so, we can make the list longer and longer. The harsh fact is there are more people who have become refugees now than since the Second World War, internally displaced people. COVID has impoverished well over 100 million people. And we live in a world that we, spent 7.5 decades constructing an international architecture, the rule of law, the development cooperation platforms. And yet in COVID-19, we also saw that, if these things are not looked after, if they are not prioritized, what happens is that people very quickly turn inwards. And the world of vaccines, for example, the experience of this extraordinary scientific breakthrough we had of having vaccines actually available became at the same time a great revelation to many who realize that if you don't have the money or you don't own the patents, you go to the back of the queue. And that queue is so long that there are still over 40, 50 countries right now where less than 10% of the population have had their first dose. So I think, Masood, not to start with a dystopian narrative, but I think let's be very frank in our discussion today. This is not a happy world. This is a world that is looking at many of the things that it has invested so much energy into building, in possibly losing it just in a matter of months or years. And that is a very serious reminder of why development and the discussions, hopefully you and I will have this afternoon, about why development matters and how development thinking has to evolve also. On the one hand, building resilience, on the other hand, being able to respond to crisis, but also building the kind of societies that, the Agenda 2030, the SDGs began to describe to us, because they gave us an understanding of what would end up tripping us all over if we didn't actually pay attention to it.
Yeah, that's so true. And, I was going to go to another direction, but from what you've just said, I want to pick up on what you said, because I think as you painted this picture of how so many fronts we are under stress, whether it's the response, but if you look at the response to COVID, great at one level in terms of the fastest ever development of a vaccine in the history of the world, but pathetic in terms of the inability to make sure that the vaccines that were being produced were being distributed in a way that was seen as being more equitable. And even today, as you say, 40, 50 countries, less than 1 in 10 people have been vaccinated. Similarly, climate change, we had COP26, a lot of discussion around that, but still the emissions keep growing. Similarly, on debt, we've had the numbers grow, and we haven't started talking yet about Afghanistan, but last appeal that the UN had for, I think it was $4.5 billion, was short by 2. So the problems are all there, and I think reasonably well understood by the people who are focused on them. What needs to be done is also more and more clear. It's not as if we don't know what needs to be done, but the ability to get ourselves organized and to build the kind of consensus the minimum consensus necessary to act on those issues is what seems to be holding it up. And so those are the times when we would have turned to, well, that's what the global multilateral system is all about. The UN is center of it, the Bretton Woods institutions, the specialized agencies, but they are all struggling in being able to respond, because ultimately they are only able to respond when their membership is willing to come together and do that. So I really wanted to drill a little bit into your sense of how do we go from recognition of the problems to finding ways to make progress on the solutions, even if they are one step at a time or one piece at a time, or is it some great big bang on a whole new global design of cooperation? What's your take on that?
Well, not easy to answer, but let me begin by saying I think the only way is to move forward with courage and not simply go on doing the same thing you have been doing in the past. I mean, multilateralism, the international architecture of institutions, of platforms that we have built up, I'm not putting that into question, because I think anybody who for a moment reflects on why, for example, the United Nations was created in 1945 and against what backdrop, I think would struggle to argue that the world does not need a United Nations in the world of today in terms of the ideas and ideals that it reflected of a generation that had seen and looked into the abyss of war, the Second World War. But let us also recognize institutions become calcified, member states and public attitudes become complacent. We had the peace dividend. The world looked very good. Economies were growing. Developing countries were becoming wealthier. We were in a couple of decades almost where things just seemed to be going in the right direction. So what on earth happened? You have to ask yourself. And I think in part we have to recognize that things and contexts change. So take, for instance, crises. I am increasingly concerned about the way that the international community seems to respond when things get complicated through maybe a war, maybe a conflict, even in natural disasters, or when there is an unpalatable government in control of a country, maybe not even recognized internationally. The first thing we do is we actually, in a sense, retreat. We default into a humanitarian response mode, which, and let me make that very clear, humanitarian responses are fundamental. They save lives. They are an integral part of our mechanisms and capacities to not simply turn away when people desperately need help. But I have time and again encountered this argument that development should not be engaged, development cooperation, for argument's sake, in complicated contexts, and we have them by the dozens, right? I can just point from Libya to Yemen, to Myanmar, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Syria, to Haiti. I mean, the list sadly is quite long, and this is not to pick out these countries on their own. And I've become increasingly convinced that actually we are facing and confronting a serial failure in the way that we have been able to respond to these crises. They essentially have become protracted crises. We've even created a new terminological way of describing them where, in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, there are girls who have been born to mothers who themselves have been born in that camp. I mean, this is terrible. This is just not the way we had intended our ability to act as an international community to actually impact on those most vulnerable and most directly affected by conflict. And I do believe that we have to take a step back. We have to, in the United Nations, to speak of ourselves, rethink the way we can deploy the political, the humanitarian, and the developmental in synchronicity. In fact, it's a report that the Bank and the United Nations put out 4 years ago in trying to understand what have we learned from these crisis settings. But sadly, the reality is that for many member states, it's politically more comfortable to revert into a humanitarian mode. The international financial institutions with their boards become extremely conservative and therefore are sitting on billions of dollars that are in theory available to avoid the worst economic implosion in these countries, but do not feel able to actually put these funds to work. And so what we actually end up with, whether from Syria to Afghanistan to Yemen, is that we try to respond, but in some parts our response actually is contributing to the further deterioration of the problem. So there's really a problem here, Houston, and I think we do need to have a more honest conversation about how it is that the international community, principled as it must be, but also realistic and practical as it should be, confronts these situations. And, you know, to extend the argument, I was appointed, yes, it's almost 5 years ago, unbelievable, to lead the United Nations Development Program. It's one of the largest entities in the international community, certainly a principal actor in the development arena. Taking an institution such as ours that is governed by member states, but at the same time is looked to by member states to offer leadership, thought leadership, innovation, evolve what it offers to developing countries, has been a fascinating journey. And maybe later in our discussion, we can come back to it. There is certainly no excuse for not changing things that clearly are not delivering results that we set out to achieve.
Yes, and I think the point you make, maybe just one issue which you raise, I want to come back on. You know, if you think about a case like Afghanistan, very clearly illustrates some of the problems that you were talking about. So, you know, pre-August, we had in place an economy and a country where a lot of the health and education infrastructure and even running costs were being covered by external financing, concessional financing, mostly, but not only grants. Then we have the change of regime in Afghanistan. The rest of the world doesn't recognize that government. And a lot of these programs suddenly start grinding to a halt and because of lack of financing. And of course, the policies that the new regime in Afghanistan wants to adopt in some of these areas are also policies that the rest of the world, which was providing financing before, not supportive of and not willing to be part of. And yet, you know, those clinics are there and those schools are there. And so you have the immediate humanitarian response, which, as you say, but the IFIs, the World Bank and others, are hamstrung. They can't act because they don't have a counterpart, a government that their membership recognizes. Now, the UN and the UNDP have a little more leeway in that situation. You could act. And then I want to get a little bit of a sense of, you know, in a practical way, how do you find ways to move forward in that difficult situation? And can we draw any lessons from that in terms of the redesign that you're saying is needed? And I agree with that, you know, in terms of how we think about this is not going to be the only situation like this in the next 5 years. So how do we think about this in the future? But just say a little bit about your Afghanistan experience and what you were able to do, but also what you were not able to do. Where did you get stuck and what lessons can we draw from that?
Let me preface my remarks by saying that whatever our judgment is of the current, as we refer to them, de facto authorities in Kabul that are now governing the country, it was known to all of us already a year to 2 years ago, partly because of an agreement that had been negotiated by the US administration with the Taliban, that there would be a change of leadership, let's put it that way. And that this was, in a sense, a transition that was envisageable. It is one reason why we in UNDP began a year and a half ago to think about that day when suddenly in Kabul, a Taliban administration would take office, or, obviously nobody quite envisaged the dramatic images that we remember from last year playing out in Kabul. But our conviction from the beginning was this was going to be an economic crisis, simply because 75% of government budgets in Afghanistan were being financed by the international community. Now, one can, on the one hand, view that as generosity, on the other hand, perhaps as an element of naivety, because if after 20 years you still are responsible for 3/4 of a government's public budget from external sources, you in part acquire a responsibility for some reasonable transition. Now, when the Taliban obviously took over Kabul so quickly, literally overnight, all of these funds were stopped. The central bank reserves that were abroad were put under a very severe regime that did not allow the central bank to access it. So literally a country of 40 million people goes into an economic freefall. And our response initially was, here are the red lines that need to be drawn. And if the Taliban want to have any form of assistance, then these are the red lines that need to be observed. Now, I fully align myself with those red lines, but I cannot understand how one would imagine that, a new leadership in a country that has fought 20 years in mountains and valleys to essentially drive out a government and its partners would now suddenly yield to all these red lines. And I think the lesson that we had learned in other conflicts, at that moment, it's not enough to simply, move into a humanitarian mode, because that is diplomatically more acceptable in many, domestic audiences, in parliaments at home, because you can't feed 40 million people like in Afghanistan from outside. Impossible. So what we have caused, in a sense, is an amplification of the challenges, because there is real hunger now in Afghanistan. People are beginning to starve. We are seeing an economic implosion where, UNDP's report from a few months back estimated that somewhere by mid-2022 to end 22, maybe 95% or more of Afghans will be living below the poverty line. And I'm afraid we're approaching that number actually before the end of the year. And yet we are struggling on how to respond as an international community. And UNDP developed a concept that said, look, you need humanitarian support. It is about saving lives. It's about stepping in where everything else is imploding. But at the same time, the only way out of this crisis is to actually begin to rebuild an economy from the community bottom-up level in order to allow people to have some form of income. And I sometimes, refer to this as the people's economy as opposed to the national economy. It's the survival economy. If you're not able to support people in a moment when essentially government has ceased to function, when an economy has hardly any currency that circulates in the country, markets have imploded, demand has collapsed, you have to find more intelligent ways to respond. And frankly, we got a lot of criticism when after August, we stepped forward with a program that we called Abadai, which did not involve working through the ministries at national level, but through direct implementation, reaching tens of thousands of small farmer households, women who lead the small and micro enterprise sector, most of them actually led by women, and beginning to reach them with support, cash for work, rehabilitation of local infrastructure, or for instance, providing solar panels. Now you may say, why would solar panels make a difference? Well, when you fly over Afghanistan today, the only green spots that I saw during my visit both in Kabul and Mazar Sharif were actually fields, and right next to them were solar panels, because that is electricity. Most of the country has no access to electricity, can't afford to pay the electricity that is imported. And so a massive solarization program off-grid, at household level, at community level, can have a massive impact on the local agricultural economy and productivity. Afghanistan, I believe, could feed itself in terms of basic food production within probably 4 to 5 years from now, but not if we continue to essentially limit ourselves to a purely humanitarian response, which ultimately does not help people to get into a productive economy mode again.
Right.
So those are some of the observations that I would.
I mean, you could actually say that, in fact, if we restrict our support to a humanitarian response, you are also laying the ground for a long-term humanitarian financing need, because it's going to happen year after year after year. There's no reason. So the only way out of this, as you say, is to allow the economy to function a bit. And So how far have you got with at least the development community taking on board that argument that you've just made, very compellingly? And then how successful do you think the development community has been in making that case to the broader political leadership in their own countries to be able to implement this approach? Because I think, the logic of it is very clear, but we seem to sort of run into a lot of political red lines on this and constraints. How do you think one takes that? How far have you got, and how can we go further in that? Because my concern is not just Afghanistan, also Afghanistan is obviously a very big issue right now. But we will encounter this over the years, and even where we may recognize the de facto authorities, we may not be able to work with them for a variety of reasons. And then we do have to find ways to do the development support. So I want to get a bit your take on your assessment, really, on how far we have got with socializing this approach.
You're right. There is a professional community that I think recognizes very much what I'm describing. And I certainly do not consider either UNDP or myself as the only ones who have this insight. The sad truth is that this is something we have known for a number of years, but we are entrapped in the politics of conflict and crisis response that is so risk averse, and yet I think ultimately underestimates our public. I found it very interesting that in some of the most, let's say, sensitive political environments, in terms of a Taliban leadership now being in charge, take Nordic countries in Europe, for instance. It was actually the Swedish NGO Committee for Afghanistan. It was Jan Egeland in Norway, who have been articulating precisely this call and saying you cannot walk away from a country in this kind of economic freefall. So I think we have perhaps become too worried about some negative press and media, which, obviously for political reasons, you can always criticize incidents. And let us also be very clear. I mean, the unfortunate, and that is putting it mildly, decision of the Taliban to announce a week before the pledging conference that they would not proceed with reopening secondary schools for girls, must rank amongst the top examples of how completely oblivious sometimes people can be of context. But I believe that in the way that I think our public can understand what it means to be a widow with 7 people that you're looking after, you've built up a micro enterprise that just about feeds your people. You cannot get the raw materials anymore. You cannot get cash to buy things with. The difference we can make to that life, and with it 7 other lives, and multiply that by thousands, in a way that is also restoring dignity. I had a meeting with NGO leaders, but also business leaders. I mean, both the women leaders in Mazar-e Sharif, and then in Kabul with private sector leaders. And they don't have to be large private sector companies. Almost without fail, they said, look, we need help, but we don't want to have just charity. We need help to be able to rebuild an economy that can sustain people. That is where the international community right now is needed most, in addition to obviously the humanitarian emergency aid, whether it is in food or in medicines that we are supplying right now as the United Nations, but also bilaterally, and NGOs also doing extraordinary work. I think the harsh truth is that sometimes you have to take some flack for doing the right thing. And I think on this issue of how do we deal with complicated settings, we need more courage, because we are misleading our own public. And ultimately, as you say, we are creating the protracted crisis that makes a country dependent on the international community more than before. But then the international community begins to walk away from it. Look at the Yemen appeal. Less than a third of this Yemen appeal that we launched about a month ago, and Yemen is in its 7th, 8th year of war, I think. we are cutting rations. We are cutting food rations right now and cutting medicine supplies because there's simply no money being made available. Afghanistan, in the midst of this, catastrophic situation, the appeal yielded to $2.2 billion. What was needed was $4.4 billion. And obviously, these are very high sums of money. I mean, I think we should all be very cognizant of the fact that we are not asking, small things of the international community. But to everybody who lives in a wealthy country, it's also worth remembering we just spent 14, 15 trillion on ourselves, in inverted commas, in the wealthier nations of the world to get through a crisis called COVID-19. And here is the connection to this particular moment also, Masood. We live in a moment where food and fuel and finance have become commodities of scarcity that are driving prices completely crazy. The irony is that the world at this very moment has enough food to feed itself, enough fuel that it could actually be making available, and certainly more money than it knows how to invest adequately right now. And yet our markets, our regulatory frameworks, our international system is not agile enough to respond to these crises in a smart way. So we end up with these extraordinary prices for a barrel of oil. Grain prices have gone up by 30, 40, 50%. And, with the rise in inflation comes interest rate rise.
So I guess, where this takes me also is to say, we can deal with these, what to do in a crisis like Afghanistan or Yemen after the fact, which is what we're now doing, trying to find a way to move forward. But is there a need for us to also be thinking a little bit more systemically of what is the way to organize development cooperation in a fragile state context? Because the assumption that until you have the reversal, everybody believes it will be a sort of linear improvement going forward. So you do invest the 80% into or 75% into the budget, but you don't at that time stop and ask yourself, what would we do when there is a reversal? Would we cut back to zero? Is there a core program? Do you think we have that kind of thinking being done so that we can start developing a more robust approach in the fragile state environments, which my belief is will be a substantial number of the future of engagement in the world, right? I mean, that's where a lot of the development cooperation will need to happen. But I'm just not sure that we have that framework sorted out. I don't know, what's your take on it, Achim?
No, we don't, I think, Masood. And I say this with, the frustration, the humility, but also the conviction that is not a permanent state we have to be in. We just have to recognize the limitations of things that we obviously recognize as being not adequate as a response, and then put forward new ones. And I know some will say, look, with hindsight, it's always easy to judge. And I do not wish to, pretend that everything that we learn when we look in the rear mirror could have been foreseen. But frankly, we do need a lot more emphasis on foresight. Lessons learned is not enough because the past doesn't give you a formula for how to deal with the present and what lies ahead. But foresight implies, first of all, understanding that there can be different scenarios, that you need to be more agile in the way you prepare for it. Another very frequently used word is prevention. Easily said, and Antonio Guterres, our UN Secretary General, made the prevention, the rediscovery of the UN as a force for prevention, very much a centerpiece of his tenure. And yet, politics and the reality around us has made that obviously very difficult. But let me put it this way. I don't think there is ever, a guarantee that from the outside you can intervene in whichever form in a domestic situation and guarantee an outcome. But we can be good partners, and we can invest with a view of recognizing that if we do it early enough, we may actually help a country avert the kind of crisis it might face. And this takes me to this notion of development cooperation. I am deeply convinced that we have left behind us this era of development aid. Just in pure numerical and relative terms, the ODA of today is a fraction relative to global GDP compared to where we were in the 60s, 70s. It's also an entirely different era. Most developing nations today are in a position where they have the human capital and also the capacity to shape and frame the pathways that they wish to take in their own national development. So development cooperation takes on a very different role. And I would argue with those who say, well, per capita GDP, you graduate, and after that, you don't need any more development aid. No, you don't need aid in the sense of here's a little bit of money to help you learn how to do it, which is an unfair way of summarizing perhaps an era, but there was an element of truth to that. Development cooperation of today is about co-investing. So take climate change. I've often used this example that people know that what happens in the next 10 to 15 years in the world's electricity generating infrastructure will in large part determine whether we are able to stay within a reasonable pathway for the 1.5 degrees. The fastest growing continent with the largest amount of energy investments in the next 2 decades is Africa. 600 to 700 million people don't yet have electricity there. And as you know, we will soon be, by mid-century, close to 2 billion African citizens. So, that's roughly 1.4 million people, or maybe 1.3, that will essentially be added to the world's electricity generating demand. Billion, sorry.
Yes.
Did I say million?
Yes.
No, billion, exactly. So right now, it is not only in a genuine development cooperation sense absolutely imperative that we massively scale up our investments to support Africa in its own investment in clean energy generating infrastructure. And secondly, that we stop looking at this as if ODA is some kind of philanthropic deed. Many African nations are investing under extremely fiscally stressed conditions, significant amounts of money to enable their citizens to have access to electricity. Now let's add the international capacity to scale that investment up and take it in one fell swoop towards renewable energy infrastructure. Africa must pivot towards a renewable energy infrastructure, both in its own interest, but also in a global climate change context. And, this morning we had a session where I heard about Namibia. I mean, Namibia has extraordinary solar and wind power potential. And with it can produce some of the cheapest electricity that would enable it to produce green hydrogen, which it could begin to export. And within a few years, producing enough electricity for its own economy would be a byproduct of a major export sector, creating jobs, economic growth, and allowing Namibia to invest in its own social and also environmental sustainability. I could give you many examples like this. So the second challenge is we have to rethink development cooperation, and we have to get out of this narrative that we are giving you money, i.e. the ODA community, and you must do what we think is an appropriate response. This is an era that's gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, of course, you could ask how much that was ever in practice the outcome, rather than a belief of how things operated, but on the ground maybe things often operated differently, even in the sort of golden age of development cooperation, as one would describe it that way. But now, one of the things that you've just pointed out is that so there is a remaining challenge of finding a way to work effectively in fragile states. We have something to do there. Not just the sort of consequence of dealing with the reversal, but even thinking about those things in advance. There's still a large unfinished agenda on dealing with absolute poverty, which has been set back. So it's clearly an important part. And there are global challenges, whether it's climate change and co-investing for a new green future of the kind of choices that you just mentioned, or dealing with global health security, where the next pandemic could come and hit us and could be worse than COVID for a variety of epidemiological and other reasons. And it could hit us well within our lifetimes. I mean, if you talk to the people, obviously, who know this stuff from looking at the history of it and who are monitoring it, this is not a one-time event. So we have these global challenges. And I do find still a little bit of reluctance, hesitation, maybe is better, within the development cooperation community itself to fully take on board these global challenges as part of what development cooperation is about, with the fear or the concern, there's always some truth in these things, that by doing that, you run the risk of raiding a limited budget that was set aside for the sort of more traditional development cooperation objectives for now dealing with these other challenges, which are important, but they need to be dealt with somewhere else. And I guess my personal take on it is, and I want to test your perspective, my personal take is that I think this notion of trying to keep these global challenges at arm's length and saying they're really a different business, nothing to do with us, is a self-defeating line of thinking for the development cooperation community. And we really need to go out and engage and embrace them and bring all the perspectives and learning we've had from 60 years of development cooperation, which you don't find always in some of the ways we're tackling the new global challenges. But I wanted to get a bit sort of, your personal sense on it, but also your thinking of how does that impact what the UNDP of the future will be doing? I mean, in 10 years from now, I mean, your successor will be having a conversation with my successor, and we hope. And how will that conversation, the context for the institutions of UNDP be different at that time?
It's a very good question. And I think, let me first of all say that I think in the way that we look at development cooperation today, it's always a continuum. So let me also not in any way sound dismissive of many of the things that were done 20 years ago in the context of development cooperation, 10 years ago. What I'm aiming at is not to say that everything was wrong, but rather that in order to get it right, you also have to evolve your understanding and the quality of the relationship between those who have the ability to mobilize resources and those who have the urgency of seeking investment. That relationship, that dynamic has changed. Now, for UNDP, in part, this is also reflected in, we adopted a new strategic plan, 1st of January. We, call it with a simple headline, Future Smart UNDP. And it is one that recognizes that there are still areas and countries where very basic challenges of poverty reduction, building up an education system or a health infrastructure are essential, but the tools may not longer be the same ones we would have used perhaps 20 years ago. Let me give you an example on the health. I co-chair with the chairman of AXA and a colleague from the World Bank, the head of MIGA, the Insurance Development Forum. One reason why UNDP began 2.5 years ago to work on insurance and then establish an insurance and risk finance facility is that we recognize through the challenge of climate change and managing risk, but also, for instance, access to health. In many countries, the equivalent of a national health service or even an adequate national health insurance will not exist for a foreseeable future. But the insurance sector, with its modern actuarial skills and technologies, is able to bring to an insurable population perhaps products in the micro health insurance arena that could perfectly well be launched right now if government put just a little bit of an incentive there for a fraction of the cost. It could actually allow people to establish their own health insurance. Now, people might say, yeah, but poor people can't afford it. One of the main drivers why people fall back into poverty after they've escaped poverty is, in fact, health. When a relative, your son, your daughter, your mother, your father, fall ill, all your savings will be mobilized to get health treatment for them. So poor people are spending on health, and trying to understand that building clinics is a sort of physical infrastructure response. Building up a micro health insurance market may actually be another way in which you can address the lack of adequate healthcare for people. And that takes me into the digital realm, where UNDP 2.5 years ago began a massive effort to try and make itself digitally more literate in order to understand how digital would change virtually every aspect of development. Today, we are an institution that offers in probably about 60 countries already, particular packages on digital readiness assessments, but also looking at building how you build a digital ecosystem, not just expanding the number of people who have access to the internet, but actually building that kind of economy and society around it, including rights to privacy that make a successful digital transition happen. And so I view UNDP as almost uniquely placed in the international development arena as an institution that is hyper-global, or hyper-local rather, but global at the same time. And that is why that contradiction you alluded to may not always be one. In helping a country in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, to transition into a low-carbon energy future can actually be genuinely in the interest of that country, while also delivering an integral part of the Paris Agreement through these nationally determined contributions. And so we invested a lot of energy in the lead up to Glasgow in working through our climate promise with 120 countries in helping them to assess where would they be willing and interested in raising their levels of ambition. So by the time of Glasgow, the Paris Agreement would not be in danger of imploding, because if you cannot raise ambitions, the Paris Agreement will fail every 5 years in terms of the cycle. Remarkably, countries did that. And now, I think equally as a development program, we are focused in the next few years on helping countries to, in a sense, mainstream their NDCs, international policies, sector policies, budgets, investment programs, because I would argue that somewhere in the next 4 to 5 years, we will close that chapter where we argue that decarbonization and addressing climate change are unjust and putting a constraint on development. In fact, development through decarbonization, I think, will most likely be the way that we will think about investing in the future of our economies. And then it's not only about solar panels. It's about a just transition. It's about those who are left behind, the rural areas where off-grid solar, for instance, can within a year or two literally change the economy fundamentally. And it's one reason why we put in our strategic plan, Masood, just to show you how far one has to go if one takes this seriously. We all know climate change is a big risk. And then we spend 4 years maybe helping 5 million, 2 million people gain access to renewables. We have set ourselves the ambition or the aspiration in the next 4 years to be a central part to enabling 500 million people to gain access to clean and affordable electricity. Because we believe as a development program, nothing less is credible. If you take climate change seriously, you take energy as a driver of development seriously, you cannot simply tinker around. And so scaling up and going to scale has to be part also of a program such as ours, responding to that global challenge through hyper-local solutions.
Right. No, absolutely. And I would say, I think the focus on moving to green and renewable energy, and the energy transition is clearly going to be a huge agenda. One dimension of that where I feel we, the international, I say we, but the international community, I think, has been a little bit, in my mind, a bit of double standards on it, is the issue of the use of natural gas in particularly in Africa, but not only in Africa. So a lot of people, I'm sure you talk to policymakers from Africa all the time, and some of them are pretty upset at the idea that while we see natural gas as a very clean and acceptable fuel for many of the countries that were the richer countries, we are pretty reluctant to support projects for natural gas as part of the future of energy in many African countries. And I think that's just something that one has to recognize and be clear about, that actually in those countries as well, that is, as long as you have a coherent energy plan that actually does come up with a much greener outcome, that can include a portfolio which might well include, in many cases, natural gas. So I don't know whether UNDP has a view on this or position on it, but it'd be interesting to see whether you have come across this kind of tension also in terms of the way we articulate our global goals at the global level and then want them applied in developing countries versus the way in which people see that those same goals are being applied in countries that can afford to finance their own projects.
So let me unpack perhaps this in terms of three different elements within it. One is the double standards, and I have a lot of understanding for, and in fact share also this sometimes dismay with applying to different standards. And let me just cite to you the last 3 weeks. The UK just published a new energy strategy in which increasing renewables is obviously a key priority, expanding nuclear with 10 new nuclear power stations or reactors, and then maximizing oil production. It's literally the terminology used. Canada has just apparently licensed one of the largest oil fields off its shores for exploration. Norway, is a country that continues to drive its development. It's, environmentally very ambitious development based on North Sea oil revenues. So I think the first thing is we all have to recognize that we are sometimes engaging in these international climate negotiations with very different yardsticks. And I think the second point is, I, for one, fully understand if somebody would say today, look, we've just discovered oil or gas in our territory, and we will go and explore it. I think we have more to gain from showing the advantages of transitioning towards a low carbon and clean energy economy than to fight oil well by oil well and gas well or gas field by gas field, especially when sovereign nations quite rightly point to a world that is at least very incoherent in the way it describes it. But I certainly would, and this is a very clear statement on my part, I do not think that development aid financing is required for that kind of investment. The oil and gas industry globally is perfectly capable of mobilizing the capital. And therefore, public taxpayers' money, precious and scarce as it is, would certainly in UNDP never, to my knowledge, and certainly in terms of my conviction, be used to invest in the exploration or development of fossil fuel power sources, because this is precious money that we want to help use to enable countries to jump into the next generation of energy technologies. Now, the last point is, how do we actually allow that transition to happen in a way that is more just? And this brings me back to my point. We need to co-invest. And I think we have run into fairly serious turbulence now in the climate negotiations, because for more than 7 years, the elusive $100 billion commitment, which is, one has to say, this is the floor, not the ceiling, quite frankly, of co-investment by wealthier nations in accelerated renewable energy deployment in developing countries, has still not been met. I mean, it is a disgrace, and frankly, completely unjustifiable in terms of the global economy, the financial resources. And so I think increasingly UNDP's answer to this is to focus on the domestic logic and rationale of a just energy transition and a competitive economy that can succeed in tomorrow's global energy-stressed economy. And that means investing today, first of all, in the kind of energy policy, that's the regulatory framework, then in an inclusive energy strategy that includes also rural areas, the poorer, because very often they are, in a sense, left out in these accelerated processes. And thirdly, mobilize private capital also domestically, which is why UNDP is increasingly focusing also with our work on SDG impact, the raising of SDG bonds, but also in working with the private sector to mobilize domestic capital, which in most countries is there and often then goes abroad to find a safe haven, to invest in projects that have a return on investment, but also an immense return on development of that country. So bottom line is, I think any country has the right to exploit the resources it finds within its territories, but no country should simply assume because that was the shortcut to the future 50 years ago, 20 years ago, it automatically remains so. And let us remember there are many developing countries who are already leading in this domain. I lived in one of them, Kenya. Kenya is a renewable energy economy today. Not totally, but Brazil with its hydro, Costa Rica, and then we have industrialized countries, Germany, Denmark, many others right now that are investing heavily in now producing close to 50% of their electricity with renewables. The entire energy economy has been turned on its head and will certainly affect developing country decision-making in different ways than it used to do in the past.
Absolutely. And I think also, if you look back at the one of our colleagues that I was talking to yesterday showed me a very interesting graph, which was, if you looked at the price of solar, the actual price per kilowatt hour over the last, I think, 15 years or so. And if you looked at the projected price for the future in every one of those years, the actual price was dropping much, much faster than what was projected to be the price going forward. So there's been a sort of exponential drop in cost compared with, and a lot of the project planning and design was based on projected prices because they were the best ones you had, which made the choices look skewed against renewables. So I think that the argument that the markets are moving us in that direction. The question is whether the systems are there to help countries make that transition in the ways that they need to. We're running out of time, Achim, and I wanted to say just one thing. We never got to it, but UNDP, obviously you do a lot of these things, but I just don't want people to walk away from this session without recognizing that you also make a huge contribution to this thinking about development issues. And the last Human Development Report, where you got a team to focus on this issue of sort of how insecurity and risk and anxieties are all coming together and increasing, that even in countries where people are doing well, anxiety levels are rising. And it can't all just be attributed to the pandemic. I mean, this is a longer term issue. And I want to see just, kind of like a 2-minute version of how you see that agenda, which is such a hugely important one, would be a great point on which to finish up.
Well, the report you refer to is New Threats to Human Security in the Anthropocene. And indeed, it is. It's actually not the full Human Development Report. It's a special report by our Human Development Report Office, which has this wonderful role of being embedded in UNDP, but essentially being an independent office. And through our discourse, it homes in on issues that need thinking ahead. And I very much like this report because it picks up on something that we began discussing well over 20 years ago, that security, the notion of security and human security, would increasingly not be defined by territoriality, but rather by freedom from want, by the ability of people to realize their aspirations, to live a life in dignity. And where that was not the case, it would create the kind of cracks and tensions that would reduce human security. Now, some in the face of this horrendous war in Ukraine have argued, well, that was very nicely put, but here you are. This is a classic example of territoriality, and therefore is human security really dependent on things beyond that? And I would argue, actually, if you study the antecedents of this current war, and if you then look at what was happening to us even before COVID, our world was not at peace with itself. And we had riots, political extremism, and increasing polarization, stumbling or leading to governments essentially being either voted out or falling out. Remember Chile, remember Paris, remember Hong Kong, all over the world. And I think it had a lot to do with precisely these kinds of factors that make societies either resilient, believe in themselves, or turn on themselves. And so this human security concept is one that has immense relevance to what happens in the future. And I think, to end on that note, to be fighting the kind of war we're currently witnessing in Ukraine, but also the conflict in Yemen, the brutality of a extremist war in the Sahel, this simply is no way to solve problems. And development is, in fact, an absolutely vital weapon in the war against war. Maybe not the best metaphor on which to end, but I think one sometimes almost has to put it in those contradictory terms, because what we're allowing to happen to ourselves, to the world right now, is nothing but a development tragedy.
Yes.
And for that, I can only hope that we can find another way forward to deal with these issues. Thank you, Masood.
I think with people like you, Achim, at the helm of the important international institutions that we have to advance not just the practical support, but also to challenge our way of thinking about these issues, to recognize that the world is different and we have to find different ways in which we can avoid the picking up of the pieces. I mean, I see the whole international effort now as largely an effort in picking up pieces, because we've really not been able to get ahead of so many problems. And the worst is watching the problems where we will be picking up pieces in the future, and climate is an obvious one, but where we could just, through a bit more action now, try and mitigate that or risk enormously. So I do see there's a huge challenge ahead. It's a different world and a different way in which we need to think. So we will continue this conversation, and hopefully next time we will do this in person, and either in your office, which looks very attractive there, or in our humble abode at CGD, which we will be happy to welcome you to.
Thank you so much, Masood, and thank you for a very, very engaging conversation. All the best to you. Thank you.